Hey folks, tonight we're diving into a story not of castles or crowns, but of gritty, glorious indulgence. Imagine yourself in a noisy medieval market. No nobles, just dirt, crowds, and a scent that's dangerously tempting. It's sweet, it's crackling, it's fried pears. Yep. In a time when supper often felt like punishment and roots mocked your soup dreams, someone had the guts to coat fruit in batter and call it bliss. You hear it first, the sizzle of hot grease, the clunk of a wooden spoon, the gleeful yelp of a kid who doesn't know how long that oil took to heat over a shaky fire. There, by a stall stacked with coarse cloth and dubious bowls, someone's tossing golden fritters onto a rag that's had a rough life. You might not make it through this century, plague, hunger, or a scalded tongue from a medieval fritter fried in sheep fat, and optimism could do you in. Before we settle in, hit that like button and subscribe if you're feeling this vibe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. I love knowing who's out there joining this medieval snack saga. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft hum, and let's sink into this tasty tale together. You hold your fritter like it's a fragile gift, still steaming from the cauldron. The batter, a messy mix of flour, eggs, and maybe some ale, because water in the 1300s was more foe than friend. The pears aren't Instagram-worthy. They're small, sour, often dented stragglers, probably swiped from a neighbor's tree in the dead of night. Scholars still debate if fritters were born from culinary genius or a village bet gone wild. Either way, they spread. By spread, we mean everyone craved them. Grubby kids, weary farmers, even the guy pretending he's only had one. The oil, usually sheep fat, reused so often it could probably recite the Lord's Prayer, but it worked, turning those battered pears into crispy, golden morsels that stuck to your fingers and your soul. If you had coin, or wanted to flex, you might get a fritter sprinkled with powdered sugar. Rare, costly, a total brag. For the rest, it was honey if you were lucky, or syrup boiled from dreams and spices that hadn't gone stale. These weren't delicate treats. They oozed, they scalded, they stained your clothes. But you didn't care. One bite erased the memory of your watery stew, or the fact that your shirt hadn't seen soap since spring. Sold at fairs, church steps, or rickety market carts that creaked and smelled of every cargo they'd ever hauled. These were chaotic delights, messy, joyful, and maybe a little risky if the cart's nails were rusty. Kids clutched them like gold. Adults snuck them between chores. Pigeons schemed to nab crumbs from distracted hands. Even the church gave a pass. Eat your fritter, say a quick prayer, and call it cardio. When done right, crunchy outside, soft and warm inside, you'd savor it, hoping the moment could outlast the turnip-flavored dread waiting at home. Not every fritter was a winner. Some were too doughy. Some pears were more tart than sweet. Sometimes the oil tasted like it had opinions. Still, even a bad fritter beat gruel and gloom. If you were lucky, you'd get one from a cook who knew how to keep the oil fresh and maybe tossed in a pinch of nutmeg, assuming bandits hadn't hit the spice trader. Eating one meant greasy hands, sugar on your chin, and a tiny burn on your tongue that said, "Worth it." You'd wipe your fingers on your tunic and lick them anyway. This wasn't just food. It was rebellion, sweetness in a world that skimped on joy. A humble pear, some flour, and a scalding pan turned into a small miracle. As you leave the stall, mouth still buzzing, you catch someone eyeing your last fritter. A kid, a sheep, a sneaky tax man, Doesn't matter. You grip it like a treasure and take that final bite. Tomorrow might bring thin soup and stale bread, but tonight, you had a fritter. And that's everything. You're still licking grease off your fingertips when you spot the next temptation: cheese curds. Or rather, a small pile of pale lumps sitting in a battered wooden bowl, suspiciously motionless, like they're debating whether to squeak or surrender. You hesitate. They don't exactly look inviting, but someone nearby is eating them with a grin that suggests either delight or dental confusion. Curiosity wins. You reach out, take one, and give it the gentlest bite. It squeaks on your teeth. Welcome to the delightfully confusing world of medieval cheese curds, snacks that didn't stretch, didn't melt, didn't age well, and didn't care. If apple fritters were the donuts of the day, cheese curds were the popcorn. Strange, inconsistent, but weirdly comforting when nothing else made sense. They weren't made to impress. Medieval cheese didn't aspire to fame. It aspired to last through a goat stepping on it. Most cheeses back then were more about survival than satisfaction, and curds were what happened before a cheese hardened enough to throw at a neighbor. Cheese curds, or baby cheese, were fresh curds skimmed off during the early stages of cheese making. You take milk, usually raw and warm from the sow, or sheep or goat, depending on what had wandered into the yard that day, and you add rennet, which, by the way, came from the stomach lining of a baby animal, because of course it did. Historians still argue whether curds were intentionally harvested or just eaten because someone was impatient and hungry. But what's certain is that they became a regular part of life. You'd see them in the hands of monks, children, and travelers who needed something portable and vaguely nutritious to chew on between arguments about grain taxes, and who left the abbey gate open. They were pressed, lightly salted, and either eaten fresh or packed away for a time when bread felt too boring and turnips were being moody. Sometimes they were rubbery, sometimes soft, sometimes they squeaked like they had unfinished business. And sure, freshness was a sliding scale in the Middle Ages. Refrigeration wasn't a thing unless you considered a damp cave and a prayer to Saint Cardinus. But with enough salt and emotional resilience, most people could get through a questionable bite without complaint. You could fry them, scatter them into stew, or just eat them straight out of the cloth they were wrapped in. If the cow had behaved that week and not, say, kicked over the milk bucket or chased the village dog, then the curds would be fairly pleasant, mildly salty, oddly chewy, and just satisfying enough to make you forget you were standing next to someone who hadn't bathed since last Lent. For monks, they were practically a delicacy. Between long hours of prayer and even longer hours of copying texts, popping a cheese curd was a small act of edible rebellion. For peasants, they were lunch. For children, they were candy, assuming they weren't too squeaky. And for you, you're not sure yet. You take another bite, it resists, then it yields, and suddenly you understand. It's not glamorous. It's not even particularly flavorful, but it's there, reliable, mildly chewy, the snack equivalent of a loyal friend who never quite learned how to dance but still shows up every feast day with fresh socks and good intentions. They weren't made for feast tables, though they sometimes showed up when the noble guests weren't paying attention. Nobles preferred their cheese aged, layered, and wrapped in herbs, flown in from places with better weather. Curds were the people's cheese. honest, humble, and slightly odd. Of course, not everyone loved them. Some found the texture unsettling. Others didn't appreciate the mystery of not knowing if a bite would be soft, springy, or slightly alarmed. But in a world where snack usually meant bread that could double as roofing material or broth that looked like it needed therapy, curds were a win. You finish the last one in your hand. It squeaks a little in protest. Or maybe that was your teeth. Either way, you're not mad about it. And as you pass a traveling merchant selling 3-day-old cabbage soup with a side of existential dread, you realize something. That unassuming, slightly weird clump of curd. It made your day better. The scent hits you first. Earthy, damp, with the faintest whiff of desperation and nutmeg. You follow your nose past stalls of onions and anxiety, and there it is. A pie. Sort of. You lean in closer, inspecting the lumpy golden crust, the suspiciously beige filling, and the faint steam rising like a prayer. Turnip pie. Someone, somewhere, once looked at a turnip and thought, what if this could be dessert? And no one stopped them. You take a cautious bite. It's warm. Software a little sweet. Definitely strange. But surprisingly, not terrible. In the Middle Ages, sugar was expensive. Apples weren't always in season. And human hope was a major ingredient in most recipes. The humble turnip, that humble root so often boiled into submission or mashed into apology, suddenly found itself at the center of culinary reinvention. Turnips were cheap, abundant, and misunderstood. Pies, meanwhile, were the duct tape of medieval cuisine. If you could stuff it in a crust and bake it, you could probably pass it off as food. Historians still argue whether turnip pies were genuine attempts at pleasure or simply ways to hide spoiled vegetables. Either way, the method was as inventive as it was questionable. First, the turnips were peeled and boiled, assuming the fire was hot and the cook had patience. Then mashed with a bit of egg, maybe a drizzle of honey, or a handful of dried fruit, if the household was feeling generous, or if someone raided the monastery pantry. The filling was poured into a crust made of flour, water, and the resilience of a woman who had 3 children. No oven thermometer, and endless hope. The result? Sometimes edible. Other times, it tasted like someone dared a goat to bake, but the pie endured. Why? Because it filled bellies. It disguised bitterness. And with enough spices, nutmeg if you were rich, pepper if you were chaotic, it could even taste like ambition. You chew slowly. There's a raisin in there. It doesn't help. Still, there's something comforting about it. This isn't a flashy snack. No one's bragging about it at the fair. Nobles wouldn't touch it unless they were slumming for sport or posing for a rustic portrait. But for everyone else, this was the good stuff. Monks made them in bulk. Fairs sold them next to cider and questionable sausages. And in peasant homes, turnip pies showed up like that cousin who's always around. Never invited, but oddly necessary. You sit down on a wooden bench with your pie, watching the crowd shuffle past. Children chase each other with sticks. A dog investigates a pile of mystery stew. A juggler drops 3 onions and pretends it was intentional. The pie warms your hands. And maybe your heart a little. It's not sweet in the way you expect, but it's trying. And in medieval Europe, trying counted. This pie is a lesson in humility. It doesn't care what you think. It shows up, it feeds you, and if you're lucky, it doesn't offend your palate. That's more than you can say for the bread you had last night. which you're pretty sure chipped a tooth. You take another bite. It's vaguely creamy now. The crust is tougher than expected. You pause to wonder if it was meant to be eaten or used as a mild weapon. Then again, in a world without dessert standards or Yelp reviews, anything warm with a crust was a win. And so the turnip pie continues its quiet legacy, not because it's great, but because it exists. Because someone had the audacity to pretend a turnip could be pudding. And because in the end, we all need something that tries to be a little better than it is, even if it still tastes like root vegetables and indecision. You wrap up the rest and tuck it in your satchel. It might not be good enough to finish now, but it's honest enough to keep for later. And who knows, maybe tomorrow it'll taste better, or maybe it'll attract a goat. Either way, you're oddly comforted. You've barely digested the last of the turnip pie when you catch sight of a thick, hand-sized pocket of golden crust being passed from vendor to hungry customer. It looks like a pie, smells like one too, but it's not meant to be sliced. It's meant to be held. This, you realize, is the medieval meat pasty, the snack that asks no questions and expects none in return. You sidle closer. The vendor eyes you knowingly and hands over a hot, slightly scorched crescent that radiates both warmth and danger. It's flaky in places, rock hard in others. You take a bite anyway. The crust crumbles in your hands. The inside is mysterious. You chew, slowly, something meaty, possibly rabbit, possibly eel. It's hard to tell, but it's seasoned well enough that you're willing to forgive the ambiguity. This is comfort food in a century that doesn't comfort. The meat pasty isn't just a snack, it's an edible survival strategy, made of whatever the cook could get their hands on, wrapped in thick pastry, and baked to the kind of golden that hides everything you don't want to ask about. Historians still debate whether the pasty originated with miners, soldiers, or desperate homemakers trying to make a meal portable enough to survive the commute and flavorful enough to not spark a mutiny. What's agreed upon is its genius. One self-contained pie, transportable, hearty, and plausibly edible even if dropped, sat on, or mildly cursed. The crust is not just food, it's a tool. In some regions, it was made thicker along one edge, so it could be held with dirty hands and then tossed, not into a bin, but to the rats or spirits. Depending on your level of superstition, you either feared spiritual revenge or rodent retaliation. Either way, nobody ate the handle. Inside, the filling varied wildly. If you lived near a noble's manor or a generous hunting estate, your pasty might contain venison, mutton, or pork. If you lived anywhere else, the contents could include rabbit, pigeon, eel, or, on one particularly confusing occasion, hedgehog. And yes, spices help. Sage, garlic, pepper, maybe some rosemary if your village hadn't collectively sneezed through the entire herb stockpile. Spices didn't just add flavor, they added plausible deniability. You take another bite. The meat has texture now. Chewy, a little salty. There's a sliver of something you hope is root vegetable, and not, well, you're not going to think about that. Because here's the secret to enjoying a meat pasty. You don't ask, you just eat, and hope the cook was in a good mood. These were the working class's reward for surviving another day. Farmers grabbed them before heading to the fields. Soldiers stuffed them into their packs beside flasks of vinegar and bad intentions. Merchants ate them while walking, arguing, or pretending to haggle. Even the devout weren't left out. Vegetarian versions existed too, filled with leeks, onions, and cheese. perfect for fasting days or when meat was scarce and cabbages had filed for early retirement. You remember the crust markings too, initials or crude symbols pressed into the edge so no one accidentally grabbed the wrong lunch. Because let's be honest, trust is great, but food ownership is sacred. The pasty, in its greasy glory, didn't discriminate. It was the great medieval equalizer. Whether you were trudging through the snow, bartering for chickens, or watching a public execution, it happened. A pasty fit neatly in one hand and reminded you that calories were victory. You take one last bite, now fully committed. It burns slightly. You flinch, but not enough to stop. Because this is good. You glance at the vendor again. He's wrapping another one in rough linen, handing it off with a nod to a woman carrying firewood and the quiet pride of someone who knows dinner's sordid. And it hits you. This isn't just food. It's ritual. It's armor. It's your portable permission to keep going. The crust crumbles a little more in your hand. A smear of grease glistens on your sleeve. Somewhere behind you, a dog whines. You offer him the last bite of the crust, the handle. He sniffs it, sneezes, and walks away. Smart dog. But you do it again. Because in a world full of hard days and harder bread, the meat pasty is a flaky little miracle. Mysterious, hot, possibly haunted, and absolutely worth every bite. You wander through the narrow market lane, licking your fingers and wishing you hadn't eaten that last bite of possibly eel pasty. Then just ahead, something glimmers faintly in a wooden bowl, catching the sunlight like treasure or dental risk. Small, round, sugar-coated seeds. You lean in and inhale a scent you weren't expecting. Licorice, with a hint of danger. Candied fennel seeds, part treat, part digestive, part medieval tooth grenade. You pinch one between your fingers and bite down gently. There's a crunch, sharp, satisfying, a little aggressive, and then a burst of herbal sweetness that tastes like someone tried to hide an entire apothecary in a candy shell. In a world where toothbrushing meant rinsing with wine and hoping for mercy, these seeds were the closest thing to breath mints, popular among nobles, offered after heavy meals to refresh the mouth, which probably meant covering up the flavor of goose fat, mead, and minor regret. Historians still argue whether candied fennel originated as a digestive aid or a subtle warning to sit farther away. What's agreed upon is the effort. Sugar in the Middle Ages was no joke. It had to be imported, boiled, beaten, and poured by hand over the seeds in careful layers. No machines, just dedication and a level of optimism that sugar wouldn't immediately crystallize into a chaotic mess. You imagine a monk hunched over a bubbling pot, muttering prayers and threats to the syrup as he stirs. Not for the weak-hearted or the weak-toothed. These treats were common in noble houses. After a feast of roast peacock or stewed squirrel with raisins, a small dish would be passed around like a diplomatic gesture. Take a few. Pretend you didn't notice the mutton still clinging to your molars. Smile graciously, even if your teeth were crying inside. And fennel itself, a strong licorice-like flavor, not subtle, not universally beloved. You either liked it or you choked politely, swallowed whole, and nodded as if this was exactly the flavor profile you were expecting after roast swan and wine you couldn't pronounce. But fennel wasn't just for flair, it was functional. People believed it aided digestion, soothed stomachs, and made your burps seem less judgmental. Imagine eating 3 kinds of birds in one sitting and chasing it down with wine the color of suspicion. You'd want a miracle seed too. You pop another into your mouth. The coating is harder than the first. This one might break something. You hesitate, then chomp down bravely. It holds, then cracks with authority. You nod, feeling oddly victorious. Of course, not everyone had access to sugar. The common folk made their own version with honey and vague optimism. Less candy, more herbal experiment. But it worked. Sort of. If you squinted. If you really believed. Some wealthy households served candied fennel in ornate bowls shaped like swans or dragons. Others just tossed them into a wooden dish and hoped no one questioned the chip in the corner. But even when poorly presented, they had presence. They were crunchy, oddly refreshing, and just fancy enough to make you forget your feet were in mud and your clothes smelled like sheep. Which, to be fair, they probably did. And there was something else. Danger. These weren't soft. You didn't chew casually. You tested. You tapped them on your teeth. You committed slowly. Because cracking your molar on a fennel seed was the kind of thing that could ruin your week and your ability to chew pasties. But the reward, a clean-tasting finish. A brief moment where you felt like maybe, just maybe, you weren't a walking soup of medieval hygiene problems. You watch a nobleman nearby daintily pop one into his mouth, nodding as if he's savoring the complexity. His wife doesn't notice the one that just slipped down her sleeve. No one says anything. That's the etiquette. For the rest of us, it's less about etiquette and more about curiosity. These little seeds are part dessert, part breath freshener, part dental test. They make you sit up straighter even if you're wearing a tunic with turnip stains. You take one more, the final one. The crunch feels earned, the sweetness lingers, and just like that, you understand. It's not just about flavor, it's about ritual. It's about pretending, if only for a moment, that you live in a world where your breath can smell like fennel instead of fear. The air is growing heavier now, tinged with wood smoke and the distant sigh of overcooked cabbage. You meander down a path littered with husks, peels, and the quiet groans of overfed merchants. That's when your eyes fall on something utterly unmissable. A tray of square, dense, golden brown cakes that seem to hum with restrained drama. Honey cakes. Not delicate, not cute. These are slabs. They look like something you'd use to prop open a barn door. And possibly did. But they smell divine. Warm, sweet, comforting. Like childhood memories that never quite happened. You pick one up. It's heavier than expected. It has the weight of commitment. Your first bite, chewy. Almost defiantly so. Not soft like modern cake. More like it's daring you to call it dry. But the flavor? Oh, it wins you back. Deep, earthy sweetness from fermented honey. And just a hint of spice. Cloves. Maybe nutmeg. Maybe just medieval dust. You're not sure. But it works. In a time when sugar was a fantasy for most, and cakes were rarer than kindness from your landlord, honey was the star. Beekeeping in medieval Europe was practically a sacred art, performed by monks and farmers alike, often while being stung into spiritual enlightenment. Historians still argue whether honey cakes were common fare or reserved for feast days and subtle emotional manipulation. But the consensus is this: if you had honey, you used it. You poured it over porridge, into mead, onto wounds, and, yes, into cake batter with the determination of a man trying to woo both God and his neighbor's daughter. These cakes weren't baked for fluffiness. There was no baking soda, no cream. Just flour, eggs, on a good day, spices, and honey. You stirred until your arm gave out, shaped the dough into bricks, and baked them in a hearth that operated on vibes and smoke signals. And once they cooled, they didn't crumble. They waited. You could carry one in a satchel for days, weeks even. Medieval scholars believed properly prepared honey cakes could last through a small apocalypse and still be slightly edible. You take another bite. This one's got a walnut in it. Bonus treasure. These cakes weren't just snacks, they were statements. If you served honey cake at a gathering, it meant you were doing well enough to own bees or barter with someone who did. They were the medieval version of flexing on your neighbors, only tastier. Monks baked them for pilgrims. Housewives made them during festivals. Soldiers carried them into battle because nothing says, "I'm emotionally ready for combat," like a food brick soaked in bee syrup. But they also had emotional weight. In many households, they were gifted as tokens of thanks, of forgiveness, of "please don't set fire to our stables again." They were layered with meaning and molasses-like texture. You watch a woman sell slices to 3 squabbling children, each biting into their piece with suspicious calm. They stop bickering. They chew in synchronized silence. It's a honey cake miracle. Of course, not all were made equal. Some were underbaked and dense as regret. Others burned on the edges but stayed raw in the middle. You couldn't always tell by looking, and once you bit in, you were committed. This was not food you could ghost. You had to chew your way through the emotions. And maybe that's the point. These weren't just desserts. They were edible metaphors. They asked something of you. Patience, faith, a strong jawline. You finish the last bite slowly. There's a slight crunch from a stray anise seed. Unexpected, but not unpleasant. Like a plot twist in a play about grain shortages. The vendor smiles at you. You nod respectfully. You both know what just happened. You didn't just eat a snack. You passed a medieval rite of passage. And as you walk away, that lingering taste of honey stays with you. Not bright or sugary, but deep. Melancholy almost. As if the cake itself is whispering, "Life is sweet, but also chew carefully." You smile. The crowd thins as you stroll toward the edge of the market square, where the smells turn less sweet and more intriguing. There's a stall here with fewer decorations, fewer smiles, and a very large pile of something crispy and golden stacked like firewood. You step closer, and the vendor gestures proudly. "Fish skin cracklings," he says. You blink, then blink again. You are expecting something, anything else. Still, you reach out. The texture is hard, ridged, irregular, like something between bark and a secret. You bite into one. It crackles like dry parchment, then collapses into sharp, salty flakes of pure commitment. It's, addictive. These were not prestige snacks. These were survival snacks, made from the parts of the fish nobody else wanted, because waste not, want not, and also because fish didn't come cheap. Coastal towns prized every scale, every scrap. Inland fish were a luxury. But once you had one, you used everything. The skin scraped clean and dried in the sun or near a smoky fire was sometimes salted, sometimes spiced, sometimes just hoped upon, then fried in animal fat until it transformed into what scholars now call a bold culinary decision. Historians still argue whether fish skin cracklings were consumed for pleasure, protein, or pure spite. But they existed, crunchy, oily, questionably fragrant, and they stayed with you. Emotionally, dentally, spiritually. You grab another one, this time bracing yourself for impact. It explodes on the first bite like firewood under a boot heel, then floods your mouth with salt, umami, and something vaguely reminiscent of the sea, or possibly a riverbank at low tide. And here's the strange part. You want another. There's a rhythm to it now. Bite, crunch, chew. Consider your life choices. Repeat. You're not alone either. A group of laborers nearby are passing around a sack of the stuff, laughing between mouthfuls, like this is the best joke they've heard all week. And maybe it is, because medieval humor was often built on scarcity. If you could laugh while eating fish skins, you were winning. These were snacks that came with a story. Maybe they were left behind after a feast. Maybe the fish was too small to waste any part. Or maybe, just maybe, someone looked at a drying rack full of skins and thought, what if we fried our shame and made it tasty? That someone is your hero. You glance over and see the vendor dipping another strip into a cauldron of bubbling fat. The hiss is loud, violent, slightly threatening. The scent is sharper now, tinged with rosemary and maybe regret. You respect it. This isn't food that tries to charm you. It doesn't soften its edges or disguise its origin. It's honest, brutally so. Fish skin cracklings don't flirt. They challenge. They dare you to crunch, to taste history, to snack like someone who just caught dinner with their bare hands and didn't have time to be delicate. And there's something oddly luxurious about it. Yes, it's peasant food. Yes, it's made of what nobles would throw to the dogs. But in the right moment, in the right hands, it's exquisite. Like defiance dipped in oil and served with a wink. You crunch down on another. It tastes of sea salt and mystery. You feel alive. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Monasteries banned them for Lent. Nobles sneered at them until someone figured out how to serve them with mustard and call it an amuse-bouche. And some towns only allowed their sale outside the city gates, next to the turnip liquor and the guy who juggles with one eye. Still, they endured, because people don't forget snacks that make them feel something. You wrap a few in cloth and tuck them into your pouch. They'll keep, possibly forever, possibly longer than your current lifespan, but that's part of the charm. You walk away, still chewing, smiling faintly, as a child nearby dares his friend to eat 3 in a row. He does. He survives. Barely. The crowd cheers. And you're just glad you tried, because now you know. Sometimes the loudest crunch comes from the quietest corner of the market. Your pouch now crackles faintly with every step. Thank the fish skins. But you barely notice because the next smell you catch is unlike anything else. Warm, bready, tangy, and just a little sour. It pulls you down an alley where a woman in a wool apron stirs a massive cauldron of something beige and bubbling. She ladles it into thick wooden bowls, then, without ceremony, drops in a hunk of coarse brown bread. You've just found the medieval version of soul food, bread soaked in ale. You take a bowl and sit on the nearest stump. It's not a meal. It's not a soup. It's not porridge. It's just warmth, slightly alcoholic warmth. You scoop a spoonful into your mouth, and it's surprisingly satisfying. The bread is halfway disintegrated, soft and heavy like wet sponge. The ale gives it a malty tang, bitter at first, then mellow, like a tavern hug. This was poor man's comfort food, sometimes called ale bread or sops. This dish was common across medieval Europe. When leftovers piled up and appetites grew urgent, people turned to what they always had: stale bread and weak beer. Historians still argue whether this was a breakfast, a snack, or just an edible cry for help. But it was everywhere. Farmers had it before dawn, children ate it before chores, and the elderly, toothless and wise, made it their daily ritual. There's something oddly beautiful about it. The ale wasn't strong. Think of it more like a liquid vitamin with ambitions. Beer was safer than water in most places, lightly fermented and mildly nourishing. Bread, on the other hand, was eternal. Even when stale, it refused to die. Together, they made survival taste vaguely okay. You watch a boy nearby swirl his spoon, chasing soggy crusts through the liquid like treasures. He slurps loudly. No one judges, because here, loud slurping means satisfaction. The bread used for this wasn't your fluffy modern kind. This was dense, stone ground, and stubborn. It could knock out a squirrel if thrown. But once softened in ale, it surrendered, kind of. You take another bite. The texture is strange. Not quite stew, not quite pudding, but it works. It fills you, not just your stomach, but that strange hollow space you didn't know was empty until now. You imagine a medieval laborer, cold, tired, back aching, sitting by a fire, warming his hands around a bowl like this. No spices, no garnish, just heat, calories, and a quiet kind of peace. Sometimes they added scraps, an onion here, a bit of meat there. On special days, maybe even a poached egg. But most of the time, it was just the bread and the ale, humble, sincere, slightly fizzy. In wealthier homes, they called it sops in ale or trencher soak and acted like it was refined. But let's be honest, it was still mush, just served with a better spoon. You finish your bowl slowly. It leaves a residue on the sides. You scrape it with your finger. No shame. This is not a dish that invites manners. It invites participation. The woman refills a bowl for an old man who tips her with 2 buttons and a joke about monks. She laughs. You smile, because in a world where meals were often transactional, this one feels like a gift. And then you notice something else. Behind her, there's a stack of loaves, hard as stone, wrapped in cloth. She's prepping for tomorrow, soaking the worst of today into something nourishing for someone else. This, you realize, is sustainability before it had a name. It's care, disguised as carbohydrates. You rise, thank her with a nod, and move on. Warmer now, not just from the ale, but from the knowledge that sometimes the best meals are the ones that ask nothing of you but presence. You've barely taken 10 steps before the sharp scent of something fermented and possibly illegal hits your nose like a surprise sermon. You follow it to a rickety table where 2 men sit, cups in hand, grinning like they've discovered fire. One notices you. "Turnip beer," he says. "Want a sip?" You pause. Beer is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Still, curiosity wins. The man hands you a wooden cup carved with what might be saints or squirrels. Hard to tell. You brace yourself and take a cautious sip. Oh, it's fizzy, tart, a little earthy, and definitely strange. But once you get past the idea that you're drinking what used to be root vegetable salad, it's actually not bad. Welcome to the world of medieval vegetable booze, where people brewed whatever fermented and prayed their guts agreed. When barley was scarce and grapes were fantasies, people turned to what they had. Apples, beets, even turnips. These weren't elegant wines or robust ales. These were experiments, sometimes delicious, sometimes dangerous, always entertaining. Historians still argue whether peasant brews like turnip beer were born of desperation or creative genius, but no one denies they kept people hydrated, mildly intoxicated, and slightly confused, all necessary states for surviving the Middle Ages. The brewing process? Questionable. Step 1. Boil chopped turnips with wild herbs. Step 2. Strain, cool, and mix with old bread or grain mash. Step 3. Let it sit in a jug for a few days and hope it doesn't bite back. Step 4. Serve it to your friends and pretend the foam is intentional. You sip again. There's a sourness that lingers like a memory of poor choices, but it grows on you, and you start to understand why this stuff caught on. In some towns, it became a currency of its own, traded for favors, meals, or forgiveness. In others, it was outlawed, mostly because someone's uncle went blind and declared he could talk to saints through the walls. You look around. A few children watch with interest, but they know better. This isn't their drink. This is for adults, tired ones, chatty ones, and those who believe in homemade miracles. The man next to you laughs as he drinks. Keeps the belly warm, he says, and the memories soft. You nod. It's hard to argue with that. Not all peasant brews were turnip-based. Some favored nettles, dandelions, or even birch sap. Each region had its signature disaster. Some tasted like cider, others like betrayal. But they all shared one thing: a refusal to be boring. You finish your cup and hand it back. Your lips tingle. You're either lightly buzzed or about to develop character. Either way, the world feels fuzzier around the edges and a little funnier. That's the magic of medieval brewing. It wasn't about getting drunk. It was about softening the day, about laughing at your own hunger, about celebrating that you made it this far without dying of damp socks. And perhaps most importantly, it brought people together. No matter how rough your day, how burnt your crust, or how many turnips betrayed you, you could always raise a mug and say, "Well, at least we still have this." You walk away slowly, warmed from the inside out. And as the turnip beer hums softly through your bloodstream, you realize something wonderful. You don't need luxury to feel joy. Just a strange drink, a shared smile, and a stubborn sense of humor. As the light shifts and shadows stretch longer across the cobblestones, your pace slows, not from fatigue, but from fullness. Mentally, physically, and perhaps a little spiritually, thanks to the turnip beer still tap dancing behind your eyes. That's when you smell smoke again, not firewood or hearth fire, but something more primal, meatier. You follow it, nose first, toward a gathering of children and dogs circling a large spit. There, turning slowly over a bed of embers, is a hedgehog. Not a metaphor. Not a nickname. A literal hedgehog, skewered, roasted, and slowly crisping. And yes, you're about to try it. You'd heard the stories, of course. Peasants roasting hedgehogs as protein of last resort. But to see it, smell it, and consider actually eating it, that's a new frontier. A young girl approaches you, holding out a sliver on a flat piece of bark. You accept it. It's hot, smells like pork, and the edges are laced with ash. You chew, slowly. It's surprisingly rich, gamey, but tender, like wild rabbit with ambition. See, in the medieval diet, meat was precious. Livestock were wealth, not food. Pigs, chickens, cows, they were currency, inheritance, dowries, which meant if you wanted meat, you got creative. Hedgehogs, they were everywhere. And, according to folk wisdom, they cleansed the blood and cured night sadness. Also, they were small, didn't fight back, and when wrapped in clay and tossed into fire pits, their quills came off with the baked mud. Voila! Medieval dequilling. Historians still argue whether hedgehogs were actually a staple or just a novelty served when deer weren't cooperating. But what's certain is that they represented survival, adaptability, and, occasionally, unfortunate roadkill turned into stew. You take another bite, it's saltier than expected. Someone likely rubbed it with herbs, rosemary, thyme, or just the clean dirt of rural cooking. Either way, it works. A woman nearby slices one open with practiced hands. The meat is pale pink. Children gather around like it's a holiday turkey, and you realize this isn't desperation, it's celebration, because when food is scarce, anything that feeds many is a feast. You overhear a story. A boy once caught 6 in 1 week and was treated like royalty until the next plague. You're not sure if that's a compliment or a curse, but everyone laughs. Hedgehog humor, it's a niche. In some regions, these little creatures were considered forest meat, not hunted with bows or spears, but found, coaxed, caught. Rolled up in balls and hiding beneath brambles, they were snacks in armor, nature's crunchy paradox. Of course, not everyone approved. Monasteries sometimes forbade it. Nobles scoffed. And there's a record of one lord fainting when served hedgehog pie by accident. But for the rest, it was rustic, real, and respected. You finish your bite and feel a surprising sense of gratitude, not because it's the best thing you've eaten today, but because it reminds you people always find a way. You glance around at the crowd, at the simple joy of food that came from earth, fire, and a little audacity. And you think to yourself, if someone could look at a hedgehog and see dinner, then surely anything is possible. You leave the hedgehog circle behind, the last hints of roast and soot lingering on your tongue, like a strange but not unwelcome goodbye. Ahead, the path winds toward the orchard edge of the village, where dusk is thickening, and the laughter softens into murmurs. Lanterns flicker like lazy fireflies, and then, like a whisper through damp grass, you catch another scent. Faint, floral, fermented. You follow it to a worn wooden cart with an old woman seated behind it, hand stained with berry juice and thyme. On display, small clay jars sealed with wax, each marked with a scratchy symbol. She lifts one, smiles a nearly toothless smile, and offers you a spoon. You're about to meet the mystery jam. You dip the spoon into the dark, shimmering preserve. It's thicker than honey, studded with seeds, and oddly fragrant. You taste. Whoa, it's tart, like black currants. But then comes the sweetness, slow and sticky, chased by an herbal note that tastes vaguely like Bozel having an existential crisis. You can't place it. Rowan and elder, she says. And a touch of bee balm. Right, sure, that clears it up. This is the medieval answer to fruit candy, minus the packaging, and plus a high risk of botulism if improperly sealed. But back then, it was gold. Jams and preserves were a way to bottle summer, save sweetness, and cling to brightness when winter made everything taste like damp shoes. Historians still argue whether these jams were daily fare or festival luxury, but the general agreement is this: if you had fruit, sugar, or more likely, honey, and thyme, you made jam. Not for toast. Toast wasn't a thing. But to smear on trenchers, sweeten porridges, fill pastries, or just eat with a spoon when no one was looking. You take another taste. This one's spicier, like mulled wine pretending to be a spread. Clove, cinnamon. You don't ask. Part of the fun is not knowing. And in truth, medieval jam was full of surprises. It wasn't just about taste. It was medicine, tradition, magic. Some believed elderberry could ward off plague. Others thought Rowan protected you from witches. And bee balm. Well, that just made the bees happy. You glance around. A few villagers pass by, nodding at the old woman, dropping coins or bread in exchange for jars. One man kisses his before pocketing it. Superstition, sentiment, sugar withdrawal. Hard to say. In some villages, these jams were made communally. A cauldron in the center of a field, women stirring with spoons longer than most relationships, children chasing off wasps, while the mixture thickened to perfection. You ask the woman how she knows when it's done. She grins. "It tells me." You nod, pretending you understand. Maybe you do. Maybe good food does whisper to those who listen. You buy a jar. She wraps it in cloth. It's warm, still slightly sticky, still glowing with something you can't name. And as you walk away, the sky deepens into blue lavender shadow. You tuck the jar into your pouch next to the cracklings and hedgehog bone. Your hands smell of berry and smoke. Your stomach hums. There's something sacred about it, this act of turning fleeting fruit into something lasting. A little sweet rebellion against the cold months ahead. Because if you can preserve summer in a jar, maybe you can preserve hope too. Your pouch is officially a chaos bag of history. Fish skin, hedgehog meat, jam sealed like treasure. And now, one last scent calls you onward. You'd thought the market was winding down, but no. A sudden waft of smoke, butter, and something suspiciously delicious draws you toward a circle of villagers, all watching a griddle. On it sizzles a golden disc, bubbling at the edges, flipped with flair by a man who clearly believes this is performance art. He sprinkles it with herbs, folds it like a letter from someone bold, and slides it onto a leaf for you. It's a pancake, but not your pancake. You bite in. This thing is no soft, syrup-hugged brunch plate. This is medieval, crispy at the edges, slightly sour from barley flour, a little chewy, with flecks of green that taste like spring and ambition. It fights back, and you like that. Peasant pancakes weren't Sunday morning comfort. They were survival meets creativity. Made from flour, water, sometimes eggs if you were lucky, and tossed onto hot stones or iron plates. They soaked up broth, stretched stew, or held other food like an edible wallet. But alone, they were still enough. Historians still argue whether these pancakes were peasant ingenuity or humble luxury. But one thing's certain, they were fast, filling, and flat. A medieval marvel in minimalism. This one has leeks in it, maybe nettles, possibly mustard seeds. The flavors unfold in waves, earthy, peppery, and then a hint of something sweet, honey, or just the illusion of it from the brown batter. Nearby, a boy juggles 3 in the air like hot coins. One falls. He eats it anyway. These pancakes went by many names. Oatcakes in the north, fritters in the south, fladens in Germanic regions. They were democratic, ubiquitous, sometimes made with cheese, sometimes with bits of dried apple. Always they tasted like effort. You sit on a hay bale and chew slowly. It's dense, grounding, like it was made to steady you in a storm, which, in a way, it was. After all, life in the Middle Ages was unpredictable. War, weather, wolves. You needed a meal that stuck with you. And pancakes did. You could carry them in your pouch, eat them cold, layer them like armor between you and hunger. A woman nearby stacks 10 of them, wraps them in linen, and tosses the bundle over her shoulder like a warrior. She catches you staring and says, "Market's over. Dinner's earned." You believe her. In wealthier homes, similar cakes were fried in butter and served with jam. Sound familiar? The difference was that for the average person, butter was a luxury, so these were usually fried in bacon grease, goose fat, or whatever could be scraped from the last meal's pan. The result? Pancakes that tasted like yesterday's victories. Yours is now gone. Only a smear of green and a warm handprint left on the leaf. You consider licking it. Don't worry, you're not alone. Someone else is doing the same across the square, because sometimes simple food becomes sacred, not because it's rare, but because it shows up when you need it most. These pancakes don't apologize. They don't pretend. They're honest. Tired flour and stubborn heat turned into something that says, "We made it." And tonight, under the last flicker of firelight, with the jam in your pouch and pancake warmth in your belly, you realize that's enough. The stars are peeking out now, quiet and judgmental, as you shuffle farther from the market's heart. There's a calm to this moment, the kind of hush that settles only after a full belly and a long walk through other people's lives. You pass a small chapel where candlelight flickers behind colored glass, and then you see them. A row of white-robed boys carrying baskets lined with linen. One of them opens a basket and gently hands something to a woman waiting nearby. It's not bread, not meat, not fruit. It's a wafer. You blink. A wafer? Yes. A whisper-thin pale circle no larger than your palm. It looks like it might shatter if you breathe too hard, but the woman receives it with reverence, almost as if it's not just food, but something holier, which, in fact, it kind of is. This is where things get blurry, the line between snack and sacrament, because wafers in the medieval world weren't just church fare. They were also surprisingly popular as street food, festival treats, and even proto-desserts. If you removed the holy stamp and added a drizzle of honey or a dash of cinnamon, they were basically the original cookie. Historians still argue whether these secular wafers evolved from communion bread or emerged on their own path, but they were beloved, light, portable, delicate. A luxury in texture more than substance. You approach the boy, and he offers you one. No words, just a nod. You hold it up to the moonlight. It's almost translucent, etched faintly with a pattern, maybe a cross, maybe a lily. The edge is browned, crisp like the edge of a fire-baked leaf. You bite. It doesn't taste like much. A whisper of wheat, maybe a memory of smoke. But that's kind of the point. It's not here to fill you. It's here to remind you that not every hunger needs to be fed with weight. Wafers like this were made in irons. Think medieval waffle press, but with saints instead of syrup. They were poured thin, flipped fast, cooled instantly. At grand feasts, nobles stacked them into towers, glued together with sugar paste or fruit preserves. Elsewhere, peasants treated them like seasonal magic, rare, crisp, and almost always stolen by children. You chew slowly. It dissolves like a thought. There's something humbling about it. After fish skins, pancakes, jam, and ale-sogged bread, this wafer is a whisper in a room full of drums. And yet it lingers. Not in the mouth, but in the mood. It makes you pause. The woman next to you crosses herself. The boy bows. And you feel, strangely, like you've shared in something, not just a food, but a feeling, a softness, a silence, a reminder that nourishment isn't always loud. In a world of scarcity, the wafer was paradoxical. It offered almost nothing, and yet meant so much. To the faithful, it was salvation. To the hungry, it was beauty in bite-sized form. You tuck the other half in your pouch beside the jam and hedgehog bone. It may crumble. That's okay. Something are meant to. You step back into the quiet. The bells in the chapel chime once, twice, and you walk on, lighter somehow, not just in body, but in being. The path curves gently now, taking you past the last flickers of village life and into the meadows beyond. The fields hum with cricket song, and a soft breeze carries the scent of mint and damp hay. You think you're done, that the feast is over, that the night has offered all it could. And then, something catches your eye. A small table by the roadside, lit by a lantern hanging from a crook of wood. Behind it sits a man with ink-stained hands and a tiny silver scale. But it's not books or scrolls he's weighing. It's fruit, but not fresh fruit. It's sucket. You pause. The name sounds sweet, but suspicious, like a treat that flirts with being a curse. Laid neatly on silk are glistening jewel-toned slivers of fruit. Pear, quince, orange peel, maybe even fig. They shimmer under the lantern glow, translucent and sticky, like stained glass with a sugar problem. The man gestures. Want a piece? You nod. He selects a crimson square and places it in your palm with reverence. You bite. It's intense. The texture is firm but yielding, like fruit that's been boiled into submission and then bribed with sugar. Your mouth floods with flavor, bright citrus, smoky clove, something floral and elusive. Rosewater, maybe. This is no common snack. This is luxury. Sucket, in medieval times, was what the rich called dessert when they wanted to impress. Created by boiling fruit in honey or sugar syrup until nearly candied, then dusted with exotic spices. It was the Renaissance version of I own a yacht. Some versions even included ginger, anise, and gold leaf. Historians still argue whether the term sucket refers to the fruit itself or the syrup it's stored in. Some claim it derived from sucade, a similar Mediterranean treat. Others say it's just medieval English being charmingly vague. Regardless, it was rare, it was delicate, and it was expensive. You take another bite and immediately feel like you should be sitting in a high-backed chair while contemplating your influence over land disputes. But the beauty of this moment, you're not in a castle. You're here on a moonlit path with sticky fingers and a stranger who talks about candied quince like it's a religion. He offers you another sliver, this one golden, curled like a ribbon. Orange peel, he says, from the monastery garden, took 2 weeks to make. 2 weeks, he nods. Boiled, soaked, boiled again, then dried in the cellar with rose petals and dreams. You laugh. He doesn't. The effort is staggering. In a world where salt was precious, sugar was pure magic. Imported, hoarded, locked in chests like treasure. To turn sugar into art, to embalm fruit in sweetness, was an act of absurd indulgence. And yet, it lasted. Long after fresh fruit had rotted, sucket survived. Sweetness that endured, a flavor of permanence in a world where nothing lasted long. Even peasants made crude versions, turnips or parsnips cooked in honey, apple peels dusted in ash and clove. It wasn't luxury, but it was effort. It was trying. It was saying, even now, even here, I deserve a moment of delight. You finish your slice. The sweetness lingers, coating your teeth and memories alike. The man wipes the scale, packs up his jars, and tips his hat. Last batch of the season, he says. Of course it is. You walk on, the taste still bright on your tongue. A final bite of summer, preserved, perfected, shared. And as the lantern fades behind you, you think, even in the most brutal centuries, someone always found a way to make fruit shine like glass. You're almost there now, wherever there is. The path narrows into a tunnel of willow and alder, branches sighing above like tired old men swapping stories. The night deepens. Stars are bold now, the kind of stars that make you forget electricity was ever a thing. And then you hear it. A sizzle, a snap, a smell that reaches back through centuries and wraps its fingers around your curiosity. It's eel, fried, crackling, coated in spices and secrets. You follow the sound and find a man hunched over a pan resting on glowing coals. He doesn't look up, just flips a slippery strip of meat with a forked stick and grunts toward a nearby log. You sit. A few eels rest beside him, shiny silver gray and suspiciously smug. One is already sliced, boned, curled into sizzling spirals of temptation. He hands you one, balanced on a piece of stale bread. No garnish, no explanation. You bite. Crispy skin gives way to silky flesh. It's rich, bold, not fishy, not quite chicken. Eel defies comparison. There's something primal about it, like you've just eaten a myth. Medieval folks took eels seriously. These weren't just snacks. They were currency, tribute, and sometimes punishment. In England alone, thousands of eels were paid annually in taxes. Some monasteries had eel ponds. Others had eel strategies. Historians still argue whether eels were a peasant staple or a monastery obsession, but all agree they were everywhere. In pies, stews, soups, fried, jellied, baked. If you had water, you had eel. And it wasn't just because they were delicious. They were legal loopholes. See, meat was forbidden on many church days, but fish wasn't. And eels. Technically fish. Kind of. Maybe. Let's not ask too many questions. So eels became the rebellion that followed the rules. The indulgence wrapped in righteousness. Your eel is perfect. Crispy, salty, still steaming. You lick your fingers. The man finally looks up. First of the season, he says. You nod, mouth full. Eel has a slippery mythology. Some believed it was born from mud itself. No parents, no eggs, just water willing itself into meat. Others swore. They crawled across fields in the dark, whispering secrets to farmers. Frankly, you hope that's true. The man hands you another. You accept without hesitation. In a way, this meal is the finale. The fireworks of flavor. After the earthy pancakes and delicate wafers, the subtle sucket and smoky hedgehog, fried eel is the curtain call. Bold, unapologetic, delicious. You eat slowly, not because you're full, but because you don't want this to end. You lean back, look up. The moon is high. The stars are louder now. And in this quiet moment, you realize something. None of this food was about wealth, or decadence, or even taste. It was about resilience. Every crumb, every crisped edge, every sticky sweet and crackling bone was a way of saying, I'm still here. In a world of plagues, famine, frost, and feudal taxes, people still fried eel. They still preserved fruit, still made pancakes, still nibbled wafers, still turned turnips into joy. Because even when the world forgets you, food remembers. You stand, nod to the cook, tuck a bit of bread into your pouch beside the jam, the wafer, the sucket, your little edible time capsule of the past. And as you walk back into the night, the grass brushing your ankles and the stars spilling light like flour, you think, if they could survive all that, so can you. The way back home feels gentler now. Each step is deliberate, not from exhaustion, but from carrying something new. Not just tastes or tales, but a quiet awareness. A calm that settles over you like a cloak still holding the day's warmth. The trees soften their murmurs. The grass parts with a whisper. Even the wind, so bold before, now drifts alongside you, a companion rather than a foe. Your footsteps echo, steady, soft, grounded. For a moment, the world beyond this night fades. No buzzing notifications, no looming tasks, no ticking clocks. Instead, you recall the crunch of fried herring, the aroma of spit-roasted quail, the humble pride of a crisp wafer. You think of honey sealed in clay pots, flatbreads cooked with intention, and preserves that carried the tang of summer and courage. You remember that every morsel was earned by hands roughened by earth, shaped by time, guided by care. You remember that food is memory, but also possibility. You sink into your bedroll, or perhaps just your bed. The ceiling above transforms into a starlit sky. The blanket becomes a field warmed by dawn. The quiet hums with echoes of shared laughter. In this stillness, you release. Release the clamor. Release the weight. Let sleep drift over you, softly, easily, like a ladle scooping honey, or the first sizzle of fish in a hot pan. You are safe. You are nourished. You are woven into a tale that spans ages past and mornings yet to come. So breathe, settle, and dream.